create and deploy virtual machines and vApps. All right, we're almost at the halfway point in this series, and we're finally getting around to where we're actually going to get to start working with virtual machines. You know, before you ever really probably dug into vCenter, you probably thought that working with virtual machines would have been one of the first things that you could probably be, administering. But as you've learned thus far, you've got to really set up that infrastructure first before you ever get around to the point where you begin creating and working with those VMs. This is the first in a series of 2 nuggets where we're going to talk about the whole process of working with VMs, and this is kind of the introductory part, really how to create a virtual machine, how to create a vApp, and just kind of really get you familiarized with just some of the basic settings associated with VMs and vApps, and also to understand really what the differences are between a VM and a vApp. Now, one of the things you have to be aware of whenever you're taking a look at building new virtual machines is this whole notion up here of the virtual machine hardware version. And this is important because there are actually a number of different hardware versions that are available for virtual machines today. And if you don't keep them relatively straight in your mind, you may find out that you've created virtual machines with the wrong versions. Or if you've had an environment that has evolved over time from VMware version 3 to version 4 to version 5, well, you got to pay attention to those hardware versions because different versions have different capabilities. What I'm looking at here is a knowledge base article from VMware's website titled just simply Virtual Machine Hardware Versions. And whereas this particular knowledge base article doesn't say much about what's in each version, what it does is it tells you what those different versions are. And you can see here that ESX version 2 was hardware version 3, and then ESX version 3 was 4, and 4 was 7 for some odd reason, and 5 was 8. So these are the 4 numbers associated with ESX that you have to be aware of: 3, 4, 7, and 8. And for most of us, the only 2 that we're really going to have to worry about are version 7 and 8, because these days most of our ESX versions are at version 4 and version 5. So be conscious of these 2 hardware versions because they can be important for you to ensure that the virtual machines you have can support the features that you want. I will show you here another knowledge base article. This one is called Virtual Machine Memory Limits and Hardware Versions. And this just gives you an idea for ESX between version 7 and 8, which is ESX version 4 and 5, some of the differences in the available memory that you can assign to the virtual machines that you might have. You'll notice here in version 7 you can assign virtual machines up to 255 gigabytes, or a very, very large, over 1,000 gigabytes with hardware version 8. Now, hardware version 8 also includes some other capabilities as well. It includes 32-way virtual SMP, so you can have virtual machines, very, very large virtual machines of up to 32 virtual CPUs. I mentioned here the terabyte of virtual machine RAM, which is important. There's now software support in version 8 for 3D graphics to run atop Windows Aero. ESX version 5 supports non-hardware accelerated 3D graphics, so you can run Windows Aero and some basic 3D applications inside of virtual machines, and this may be useful for you, particularly as you start thinking about desktop virtualization. Version 8 also includes USB 3.0 device support and the UEFI virtual BIOS if you need to use the Unified Extended Firmware Interface for your BIOS. So these are some of the just basic improvements that you get once you make that leap from version 7 to version 8. If you go from ESX version 4 and you migrate to version 5, as you'll find out when we talk about upgrading in a later nugget, upgrading those virtual machines and their hardware version becomes important as well. Now, with this in mind, however, there are a number of topics that we really want to talk about and kind of click through in this nugget, and they're all fairly important. I want to punt for just a minute on this discussion about vApps and when you should convert virtual machines to vApps, because I need to kind of explain what a vApp is first. But what I do want to do are some kind of basic introductory tasks associated with creating virtual machines, just the notion of what the VMware tools and how you might install them, ultimately create and work with those vApps as well, and then I want to spend a minute just chatting about the VMware converter and what this tool does. In short, it is a mechanism that allows you to convert directly physical machines to virtual machines, or of virtual machines of other types to virtual machines that are supported by the vSphere format. All of these we want to chat about here. And then a little later on in that next nugget, we'll spend some time actually discussing, okay, well, how do we manage the virtual machines that we've ultimately created? Now you'll see here I have vc.company.pri, and this is the same vCenter server that we've been working with thus far. And I already have a virtual machine created. Here's VM6. And I also have a vApp created we'll talk about here in just a minute. This virtual machine, VM6, just basic installation. It is currently running because you can see the little green VCR button or VCR arrow here that associates the fact that it is running. It is VM version 8 because it was newly created atop vSphere version 5. I got one CPU, 2 gigs of RAM, certain memory overhead that I'm currently using. The VMware tools are currently not installed. The state is powered on, and the host is ESX2.company.pri. So here for this virtual machine are some of the basic, just summary things that you can use to take a look at this virtual machine. A little bit later on, we'll talk about how you can assign resources to it and what types of resources that CPU or memory has the ability to use or maybe constrained by. I can view some performance statistics I'll take a look at a little bit later as well. The important one over here is this console for the virtual machine. Now, this VM, I literally just created the VM and I powered it on. And just like any physical computer, if I create that computer and I power it on and I don't have a DVD in the drive, well, it's probably going to boot to its BIOS. It's going to attempt to, with most machines, to try to grab information for a PXE boot. And then when it fails, it's ultimately going to find out that, well, there is no operating system found for this VM. So this is no different than what you would see with a standard server or even desktop that you would create when you just don't have an operating system disk or a PXE boot capability for rapid deploying the operating system. So let's take a look at actually powering down this VM. Okay, we don't want to actually play with this one. What we want to do is actually create a new virtual machine. I'll power this one off. And I will create another virtual machine so you can see the process that one will go through to actually create that new VM. I will start here under ESX2.company.pri, but you could go under ESX1 to right-click and choose a new virtual machine. This brings up the new virtual machine wizard, which in many ways is no different than the new virtual machine wizard that you're used to seeing inside of VMware Workstation. There's a couple of additional settings here, but nothing really huge compared to what you're probably familiar with VMware Workstation. I'm going to choose a custom configuration here so I can see all of the additional bits that appear here on the left-hand side. If I choose next, I can name that virtual machine. I'll just call it VM1, for example. And next again, you'll see that I can select a resource pool. Now, I'm going to talk about resource pools in the next nugget, so I want you to just kind of assume that you understand what these resource pools are for just a minute, and I'll explain a little bit more about them when we get into that next nugget here. If I choose the next button here, that brings up the storage selection screen. And if you remember that over the previous nuggets, we've actually created a couple of different links to storage. Now, the first one is this data store 1 that is the local storage. You'll see here it says single host. We also created an NFS storage, which connects into that Windows box. And this is, in this situation, a fairly low performing storage, so we're probably not going to use it for virtual machines. The third piece of storage that we have here is VM Data Store 1. And if you recall, this is a multiple host access piece of storage. I have both ESX1 and ESX2 that are connected into this. So this is the storage that I want to use for this virtual machine so that I can later go about doing the vMotion types of things that I want to do with this VM. I'll choose Next. And I want to ensure that I use Virtual Machine version 8 so I can enjoy all the new features. And in this case, I'm going to use Windows Server 2008, a 32-bit edition, just simply to get around any of the confusion that may occur when I'm doing nested virtualization. Now, in a production environment, you would be able to do 64-bit, but because I'm doing ESX inside of Workstation, it just makes things a lot easier here if we just run with 32-bit OSs to demonstrate a lot of the things that we're working with. I am going to click the next button here, and then you'll see I have CPUs. I can choose how many CPUs I want, no different than how I did this inside of Workstation. Same thing with the memory size here. I'll set the memory size down to just 1 gig, but this is exactly the same how we did it inside of VMware Workstation. Same thing also with the network connections. Now, there's an important note here in the fact that the number of network network connections that you have and where they will connect to is going to be directly related to how you've configured those vSwitches that we talked about back in the networking nugget. Now, if you recall, we created a VM network port group, and that's the only port group that's available for use by virtual machines. If I had other port groups, I could configure them here. Also, remember that the process of working with the virtual networking and the virtual switches is in many ways segregated than the processes one would go through for connecting the virtual machines to those switches. And so if you're thinking about how you will break apart what the different job roles are and what the actions associated with each job role will be for the different people in your environment, the type of person who will deal with the virtual switches may be at a level with more experience, I'll say, than someone who's actually creating new virtual machines. In fact, you can create these virtual switches and isolate them off with permissions so that people that maybe aren't even in IT or that are a junior level IT people can come and create virtual machines and just assign them to the correct virtual switches as you see fit. I can, if I want, add multiple network cards here. Generally, you're not going to do this unless you have the need to separate out networking across multiple different pathways. If I choose next, I can choose a SCSI controller. It's going to give me the SCSI control that it believes performs best for this OS. And then I can choose the virtual disk I want. Now, I'm going to create a new virtual disk here because I want to create that virtual disk associated with the virtual machine. If I wanted to create, after creating this virtual machine, if I wanted to create a different type of disk that wasn't encapsulated into a VMDK file, I could create a raw device mapping. Now, you'll see here it says that this gives your virtual machine direct access to a SAN, and more specifically what this says is the information that's contained within a raw device mapping is not bundled together or encapsulated into that VMDK file. There are certain types of workloads that this works fairly well with. For example, situations where I don't want to have to consolidate all of those files that make up a Windows box and its workload into a VMDK file. For now, we're interested in just working with VMDKs, so I'm going to create a new virtual disk, and I'm going to create it as a thin provisioned virtual disk of type 40 gigabytes or size 40 gigabytes. This is important because the thin provision disks, as we've talked about before, allow me to create that virtual disk but not actually consume the storage space until the virtual machine actually needs to. Now, this is different between lazy zeroed and eager zeroed in the thick provisioning model. In the thick provisioning model, I'm actually going to go about extending a full VMDK file of the size that I've set the capacity to. So in this case, if I chose thick provision lazy zeroed, well, I need to have available 40 gigs of space on that LUN that's pulled in for this data store. Now, the difference here between lazy zeroed and eager zeroed relates to whether or not you want ESX, or vSphere, to go about specifically zeroing out the contents of that VMDK file as it gets created. Now, in a lazy zeroed model, the space is provisioned, but the space probably contains some contents that were on there before. Now, the operating system doesn't care about these contents. It knows it's not there. But there are certain security guidelines that require you to eager zero out some of these thick provision virtual machines. You do this, again, only when you want ESX to go through and run a zero or drop a zero into every location that's necessary across the entire 40 gigabit size of that VMDK file. I want to make things easy, though. In making things easy, I want to use as little storage as possible. So I'm going to choose thin provision here, and I'm going to choose the location, essentially, to store with the virtual machine, meaning I want to store the virtual disk, the VMDK file, with the VMX file that's associated with that virtual machine. If I wanted to choose it, I could put it somewhere else if I wanted to. However, generally, this is not a good idea unless you have a specific reason to do so. It's generally a good idea to keep the disk file with the virtual machine configuration file. It just makes things easier, puts them all in a nice folder for you. So let's click 40 gigs, thin provision, store with the virtual machine for now. And I want to choose just the same SCSI virtual device node here. I'm not going to choose any independent mode associated with this disk. For most of the virtual machines you create, you're not going to create any, or you're not going to select independent mode for the disks, because those independent disks are not going to be impacted by snapshots, which can impact your ability to do snapshots, and it also impacts some of the backup programs that you might have. In a persistent mode, those changes are immediately and permanently written to the disk, whereas in a non-persistent mode, the changes to the disks are going to be discarded when you power off or revert to the snapshot. So these create some very special types of disk situations that you have to be conscious about before you actually select them. Again, you probably won't be using these modes very often. Choose Next, and choose Finish to complete the build of the virtual machine. And you'll see there I am. VM1 has now been created. If I take a look at the Summary tab, it looks relatively similar to VM6. My console is going to show black here because I haven't actually powered on this virtual machine. And I'm not going to power it on because you've seen what that looks like at this point. So I've got my nice guest OS here, my VM version, the CPU and memory, and all the stuff that we looked at before. In the next nugget, we're actually going to spend some time going down here into the Edit Settings location to take a look at all the different settings that are configured for this virtual machine. You need to be aware, however, that these are the specific devices, the virtual hardware devices that you've assigned to this VM. Not all of them may be necessary. A server, for example, may not need a floppy disk drive, as one example. It may not need a DVD drive in some cases. But most of these you're probably going to require for a server, or you might need to add some, for example, if you need to, by clicking the Add button here to add in additional devices. These devices just simply make them available for that virtual machine's operating system once the operating system is complete. We'll come back to this here in just a second, because really at this point what I want to do is have you understand really the difference between a virtual machine and a vApp. Now I told you that I've created two VMs here, and I've also created this one vApp. Inside of this vApp are two virtual machines that are associated with the vApp. Now I want you to kind of in your mind think about what an application is whenever you've got one that's distributed across multiple virtual machines. So let's think of our classic N-tier model. In the classic N-tier model, we have a web services layer. That would be at the top. That's what essentially provides the user interface for people when they need to work with this application. It may also have a middle tier layer, so some sort of mid-tier application. That's your business logic services in the middle. And then on the lower tier would be a database. Commonly in the classic N-tier model, those three functions are provided by three different servers. Now I only have two servers here, but maybe we can assume that one is a web server and the other one is a database server. In this vApp scenario, the reason for creating a vApp is so that all of the bits and pieces that are attributed to this application, web server, application server, database server, all of them operate as a group, which is essentially the vApp. So these virtual machines here operate as a group that is this app called my vApp. Now the vApp is stopped right now. If I wanted to, I could power on the vApp and it would go on about powering on the individual virtual machines. What I want to show you, however, is with this vApp, how you would actually configure some of the settings associated with that vApp. Now we haven't gotten into resource configuration yet. I told you we're going to just punt on this for the time being until a little bit later on when we worry about how we're going to assign virtual resources. But you can see that for the vApp, there are some properties that you can set, an IP allocation policy, and then some advanced settings as well. Now I've populated the advanced settings here just to give you some idea of what you might put in here. Classic N-tier app, right? I've got a product URL and then an application URL that I've just populated in here to give you an idea of what that looks like. I showed you the properties screen that didn't have any information in it because those properties haven't been set down here for what sorts of custom properties may be attributed to this vApp. I can create categories and labels and keys associated with these properties if I want. The idea being that in complex vApps with lots of machines, lots of virtual machines that consolidate together to create an application, I might need this information to keep all of my VMs straight. Creating that here will ultimately populate the things up here in properties. The IP allocation policy also showed fixed, which means that the virtual machine's IP addresses are going to be manually configured. There's no automatic allocation. If I wanted to, I could come over here under IP allocation and configure DHCP as my allocation scheme, or even the OVF environment if I had OVF virtual machines that were coming in from the outside, essentially as one big package that gets deployed on my system. I can also choose if I want IPv4 or 6 or both. So these provide some kind of basic settings for what vApps are. You should at this point be recognizing that a vApp, there's really not much here. So I can consolidate my virtual machines together into a vApp. I can, under the start order section here, group them into different groupings and then change their startup and shutdown actions. Perhaps if I want them to power on, I can set up the sequence to allow 2 minutes to elapse between powering on individual groups. If I have, again, the in-tier application, I may want the database to come up first and then the middleware and then the web server last. So this gives me the power to do that. But really, this is all that there is associated with the vApp. The real power with vApps come whenever you actually get into attributing and assigning resources to them. You may have a group within your organization that needs a certain amount of CPU resources, and you want to limit the entirety of their application to those levels of resources. But that's kind of really why you would create a vApp. When you have servers and services that need to operate together as a group, even as they're on different virtual machines. There's a third service or a third tab over here called vServices, and you'll notice that there's not much to see here. The vCenter extension service is the provider that's available right out of the box for registering this thing as a vCenter server extension. So you're probably not going to spend much time with this here, so I kind of gloss over this just a bit. But these are the reasons why you would create a vApp as opposed to individual virtual machines, because it allows you to collect all of those VMs that are designed to work with one single purpose together. Now there is one final task that we want to talk about here in this nugget, and that's this whole notion of VMware Converter down here at the bottom. What I've showed you so far is how you would create a virtual machine. And that's great if you have a brand new virtual machine that you need to create. If I'm installing Exchange onto this VM, well, I probably am going to create the VM and then assign a DVD to the VM and then install the operating system and install Exchange. Now, there are some situations, however, where you're going to have existing physical assets. Right? You've got an existing physical server. You've got a server that's already virtualized, but it's on some other platform, for example. And what you need to do is actually convert that machine from its old format, whether physical or on the other platform, to a version or something that vCenter can support. And this is what the vCenter Converter tool can do. And vCenter Converter is a separate download. Okay, it's a free download from VMware's website. Here I've brought up the VMware website. You can take a look at vCenter Converter. This is the process that convert virtual machines or physical machines to virtual machines. Down here at the bottom, it's essentially that free download. Now I've already downloaded the tool here. And I'm going to install it here to give you an idea of what Converter looks like throughout the entirety of the installation process. And then we'll spend a minute or two kind of poking around with Converter. It's a fairly simple tool in terms of what it does, but it's very powerful in that it gives you a lot of control over automatically taking other types of assets and then rolling them into your vCenter environment. You'll see I'm just sort of clicking through the default settings here. The one setting that's important here is whether you want to install this as a local installation or a client-server installation. Now, if you're going to manage and migrate those conversion tasks from this local machine only, well, then you just install Converter on this computer. Now, this is my vCenter computer. I'm going to use local installation because, well, I'm going to do all the tasks from this location. If I do want to, I can separate out some of those tasks in this client-server approach so that the server, for example, would be up here on vc.company.pri, and I might have my desktop operate as the client. There's also an agent, for example, that you'll notice here that's required to be installed on a computer that I intend to convert to vCenter. Okay, so there's really three pieces: client, server, and agent. I'm just going to do the local installation here. I'm going to click Next and complete the installation. Again, not much here, but I wanted you to be aware of what those two settings are because they're important depending on how you're going to go about facilitating the different conversions that you may do. Now, as this completes here, what we want to do is we want to take a look at running the vCenter Converter client. So I'm going to click Run Client Now to actually launch vCenter Converter standalone. Kind of a neat little tool. As I said before, what I do is I pointed at physical machines, at other VMware virtual machines. I pointed at Microsoft virtual PCs, at Cronus True Backup. I mean, really kind of any kind of virtual machine that's out there, I can actually convert that machine. You'll see here if I click the Convert Machine button, this is going to bring up a wizard that will allow me to identify what kind of virtual machine I want to convert. So, for example, if it's a powered on machine, I'm going to go out and then remotely install this agent onto that powered on machine to facilitate the conversion. This is fairly nice because in the case of, for example, this situation, I have my domain controller and I can go and send an agent out to that domain controller. I can complete the conversion. When the conversion's complete, I power down the physical box and I power on the logical, the virtual machine, and then I'm complete. I can do the same thing if I have a VMware infrastructure virtual machine or even one that's in Workstation or a Hyper-V server if I want. Let's play on with this powered on machine. I want to convert this powered on physical or virtual machine. I want it to actually power on dc.company.pri, and then the username will be my name and then my password. Once I'm done with that, I'm going to choose the next button, and that's going to go out and try to identify if that machine, well, if it's out there. You'll see that it is, and that the agent needs to be temporarily installed on that remote source computer. And then I also have an option of whether I want to uninstall the files when the import succeeds. You really probably will want to do this. Think about it. I've got a domain controller or an Exchange server, whatever server that's out there in the physical world that needs to be converted into vCenter version 5. What I want to do is I want to remotely send out my little agents. I want to let the agents facilitate the conversion, and then once the conversion's done, well, then I want those agents off of that original computer. So let's click yes to automatically uninstall those files, and you'll see I'm going to go about deploying that agent onto that remote computer. Once the agent is complete, you'll see that we move then to the next screen. So now I have an agent that's sitting out on dc.company.pri. You can see the source here. I have to now choose the destination. Okay, where do I want to go? Do I want to go to VMware Workstation? Or do I want to go to VMware Infrastructure? I'm going to choose VMware Infrastructure. And the server that I'm looking for should, well, let's just plug it in here, vc.company.pri with the username and the password. If I choose Next, it should connect me to my virtual center infrastructure. And you'll see here's my data center. I have 2 VMs currently in there. They're currently powered off. This is essentially the destination that I'm looking for. Okay, good. This is a good thing. If I choose Next, all right, well, where inside of that virtual center environment do I want to go? Do I want to go in ESX1 or 2? And then also, do I want to give it one or more of the specific data stores that are there? Well, obviously, I want to put it in there for VM data store because that's the location that's the shared storage. And then also, do I want VM version 7 or version 8? So this will give me the options that I need for how to convert the virtual machine. There's another options tab up here that provides some more information for setting the hard drives and things like that if I want to make adjustments to the drive settings. If I complete this wizard, which I'm not going to complete because the process can take an extremely long time, it will go about completing the P to V of that machine, that physical computer, over to the virtual environment. Now, if you've played with Ghost before, or if you've done any kind of image deployment whatsoever, this process is terribly uninteresting. You watch a progress bar as it moves from one location to the other. So again, really not that much to see here. Now, what's interesting, however, is that a number of different tasks, because these processes can take a very long period of time, it is entirely possible for me to set these tasks up so that they complete, and then they provide me information about the job ID and where they came from and where they went and their status and start time and end time. If I wanted to also, instead of converting a machine, I can configure an existing VMware infrastructure virtual machine. So I'm not so much P to Ving at this point. I'm kind of V to Ving from within one VMware infrastructure location to another. This would allow me to take a VM from somewhere else, maybe it's in Workstation, maybe it's somewhere in vCenter, and then inject it into my existing vCenter environment. Again, fairly useful, very powerful, not terribly interesting to look at, but definitely important for how you will go about actually creating and deploying virtual machines and ultimately getting them into vApps if you find a need to do so. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've talked about the kind of introductory processes associated with creating and deploying virtual machines and vApps. You got a feel for what those hardware versions are, and a little bit of information about hardware version 8 and kind of the new fun features associated with hardware version 8. We talked about virtual machines. We talked about when you'll take virtual machines and move them into vApps, and we even created and worked with some of those virtual machines. We have created and worked with the vApps as well, and even the VMware converter piece here. You'll notice here, install and work with the VMware tools. Actually, let me jump back here with the VMware tools, because this is a very interesting piece that you need to be aware of also. The VMware tools a lot of times are going to be automatically installed by the installation if you're in VMware Workstation. Now, this may not necessarily be the case in ESX and vCenter. So there's one checkbox here that I forgot to actually show you earlier on that's associated with the virtual machine here under Guest. Now, you'll see Guest and Install Upgrade VMware Tools. This is the location that you'll want to make sure that those VMware tools are actually installed after you complete installing an actual client with an actual operating system. So I'll play a little bit more with VMware tools when we get to the next nugget, but be aware that VMware tools are one of those absolute requirements once you completed installation, once you've created that VM and installed its operating system, to get that virtual machine functioning and interacting and communicating with the rest of the vCenter environment. So we talked about vApps, and then we spent a pretty good amount of time here also with VMware Converter. In that next nugget, we're going to take everything you've learned here and then expand on it so you can understand what the other configurations are associated with virtual machines. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.